of people who support the idea, or for instance, another thing that people talk about in relation to this is that they say that talking about immigration, which has also been greatly in the news, that this influx of immigrants that we have that when they come in, they cause crime, which statistics have shown is in fact not the case. In fact, the crime rate is lower amongst that population than it is among people who live here. But that doesn't matter because that perception is there, as well as the perception that we are being overrun by immigrants, which also is not true. While there has been an increase in immigration over a long period, we're talking about 20 to 30 years. In fact, if you look at recent years, immigration is way down to this country. There are less people coming into this country, legally or illegally, than there have been within the past 10 to 15 years. But again, the perception is there. So why do people believe things that might not be considered to be truthful? Well, we can talk about that at two levels. We'll stay at the ego level for the time being. The fact is that people have biases that aren't just held beliefs, but they're actually neurologically fused into the brain. So, if we take a look at the basic motivations of people, so I'm going to outline three basic motivations in people, and this has been researched through social science and psychologists seeking to find out what it is that drives us. And of course, it's very complex. And when they say what drives us, again, we're talking about what drives the ego. And I need to just sort of constantly set that aside, because this show is all about looking at things from a perspective that transcends that. But in order to transcend it, we also have to kind of understand it, or at least accept it. So there are these three dimensions, or three basic motivations that we have. We have all of them, and most people don't think along only one, but many of us have a preference for one over the other. And so that can be used to try to persuade us by arguments that play to such a style. So three different ways. Functional motives. Functional motives just simply serve a utilitarian purpose. Like pursuing planned goals. Functional thinking is logical. It has clear outcomes, so you know whether you have succeeded or not. It may well produce plans that break down work, allocating subtasks to individuals that must be completed by a certain time, perhaps even directing methods and tools to be used. Now, if you want to persuade someone who is thinking functionally, you first have to find out what they're trying to achieve and then show them how you can do this, help them do with this, or at least reassure them that you'll not stand in their way. If they see reason in your arguments, then they will be more open to accepting your ideas. So, functional motives. What comes to my mind are people who have a, to my mind, overzealous belief in science. I mean, I'm certainly always talking about science and scientific research, but often people who have this perspective think science has all of the answers, and that they know much more than they really do, and that science shows them much more than it really does. And we'll talk about that little phenomena later. Now, emotional motivation, that's very different. It's driven by emotions and can be highly irrational and can change course wherever the feelings take you. So often reason goes out the window when emotions are aroused. Not always, but that can happen. We think emotionally too, convincing ourselves easily that we are right and others are bad or incompetent. And we'll talk about that phenomena too. In many ways, we are very largely emotionally driven as our mammalian midbrain takes over, casually kicking the superior cortex into the corner. That's the part of the brain that relies upon linear or logical thinking. So if you're going to persuade an emotional thinker, you can't counter with logic. You might be perfectly right, but you'll be unlikely to change their mind. Better is to first empathize with them and be interested in their thoughts and be calm. And then you can maybe talk to them. And we're going to talk about that phenomena too. It's called confirmation bias. And that centers around an awful way, a lot around emotional motivation. And then a third way that we are driven is through our beliefs, ideological motivation. So when we subscribe to a particular ideology, whether it be a religious belief system, a political ideology, the ideology of science, the ideology of capitalism as opposed to socialism, they definitely form or motivate us in particular ways. They're assumed truths that are accepted so completely that we may not even understand that they are beliefs, as opposed to absolute truths. Including sacred beliefs. And as you might imagine, persuading ideologues is maybe the hardest of all. Sacred beliefs are, just that, sacred, and to attack them, or to appear to be attacking them, is something very upsetting. Understanding such beliefs is consequently essential, and avoiding challenging them is a good idea. Rather, you might try to use these to your advantage or nudge less deeply held beliefs. And all of these methods, and possibly persuading someone will more than likely not work. Let me just say that. They will more than likely not work. Why? Because, as I mentioned, of something called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the phenomena in which people display bias or cognitive bias and tend to search for, interpret, favor, and recall information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. And people also tend to interpret ambiguous evidence as supporting their existing position. And they can often find illusory correlations between two events that really aren't that well connected or might not be. And again, this is talked a lot about in the fact that oftentimes we hear our president saying things that aren't really true, but his supporters believe that they are. Oftentimes we'll even hear media like Fox News, for instance, perpetrating ideas that simply have no real basis in fact, but they are ideas that people believe in. So two really telling elements of confirmation bias is people believe that they know way more than they actually do. What allows us to persist in this belief is other people. So if one person says something and another person agrees with that, and then you hear a third person agree with that, and then you turn on Fox News and you hear all of these pundits talking about it, even if it's not true, they'll tend to believe it. And on top of it, there's research that shows that even if you don't particularly believe something, but you hear it constantly, one will begin to accept it. And so that has an awful lot to do with why some people may believe in things that might not be accurate. Why we hear a lot about news being fake. This is not to say there isn't something called fake news. There is. These are news reports that are literally false and created by some group or some company who's paid for advertising time and has come up with fake stories. But this is not the way this term is often being used now. It's often being used now in a way that says, if you say something I don't agree with or I don't believe, it's fake news. So we know all of that, right? I mean, we're living with this all the time now. And it's been shown scientifically that people will think the way they will hear things the way they want to hear them. No matter what is said, we will interpret it in our brains differently. So that leaves one really important way to change your mind. And that is by changing your brain. Which leads me to what the real focus of this episode is. Changing your mind.